My name is Haley, and my partners are Alex and AJ, and our presentation is on Chapter 14, Psychological Disorders. So our article talked about the Americanization of mental illness. The article began by discussing a group of anthropologists and cross-cultural psychiatrists, and they argued that mental illnesses are not discrete entities. That means that these things are not the same from start to finish. They change over time. And unlike the flu, strep throat, and other common illnesses, mental illnesses are not the same from time to time. So this means that anxiety in the United States may not be the same as anxiety in China, which also may not be the same as anxiety in the 1800s. So in different countries, there are different mental illnesses that are shaped by cultures and communities. One example is that in Southeast Asian countries, men can get a mental illness called amok, which is an episode of murderous rage followed by amnesia. Now, this may sound crazy and not make a lot of sense to us because we're in the United States. We don't really have that problem. But to them, it has something to do with their culture, and it's very common in certain time periods. So, not only can the diversity in mental illnesses be demonstrated across cultures, but like I said, you can demonstrate it across time periods as well. There was one example of this is hysterical leg paralysis, and this affected thousands of middle-class women in the 19th century. This is a prime example of women's social role at the time and the troubled mind that they experienced. Because they were put in this position where they were seen as meant to stay at home, they didn't have a lot of rights, this paralysis would happen, and we wouldn't really see this today because rights are equal and it's not really a problem. So until recently, mental illnesses were taught as a one-size-fits-all approach, and this is incorrect. Treatments to mental illnesses to other cultures is not the same as it is here, so we cannot follow this. PTSD, anorexia, depression, they've been spreading across cultures at speeds comparable to contagious diseases, which is very uncommon, and this could be a big problem. So, specific examples can be shown by Dr. Sing Lee, a psychiatrist and researcher at the University of Hong Kong. He basically watched the westernization of a culturally specific form of anorexia in the 1980s to 1990s, in Hong Kong specifically. So, to give some background, in Hong Kong, anorexia was very uncommon. There was hardly any cases, just a handful per year. And unlike in America, patients did not show intentional dieting and fear of being fat. They complained of having bloated stomachs, which is something that we wouldn't see here. It was very rare and unlike any form of the disease that was seen in America. And why is this? Well, the answer is simple. There are various cultural expectations and meanings, but this all changed in the 1900s. In Hong Kong, a young girl died due to anorexia, and the illness gained popularity. A once rare disease became extremely popular, and that same doctor that saw a few patients per year was seeing tons of patients per month. So this happens because once light is shed on something, the trend, if you want to call it a trend, grows. People may have been experiencing the same symptoms that were anorexia, but they never spoke up about it due to uncertainty and fear of being different. So time goes on, the American version of anorexia gains popularity, and bam, all of a sudden everyone realizes what they're feeling as well. An important quote that Lee said was, "When there is a cultural atmosphere in which professionals, the media, schools, doctors, and psychologists all recognize and endorse and talk about and publicize eating disorders, then people can be triggered to consciously or unconsciously pick eating disorder pathology as a way to express the conflict." And this quote directly explains what I've talked about. So why is this a problem? Well, the United States uses a manual when addressing mental illness, which is incorrect. The manual approach spreads across continents, and we're spreading false information. The individual experience and suffering in mental illnesses becomes discredited and looked past, which is very unfair to the patient. If anorexia didn't get brought up in the news in Hong Kong with that girl dying in the town center, people would never have gotten word of the name, word of the symptoms, and who was at risk. And because they did, new cases spread like wildfire, anorexia became very popular, and this became very dangerous.
Culture-based illnesses. Due to America's faster development of technology used to access the scientific aspects of the mind, the argument that America drives the interpretation of mental illnesses globally isn't out of the question. We can examine specific DNA nucleotides, and we were the first to build a medical machine such as the MRI in America. In the past, the world's mental illnesses were driven by culture, and we can now see that some diseases weren't what they seemed. Certain mental illnesses, like Koro and Amok, like Haley described, a syndrome affecting Malay men, were considered to only be present in certain cultures or domains. Psychologists think that the DSM-4, before adding culture-bound disorders, was the only true text for mental illnesses. The DSM-4, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, was the text used by psychologists to get objective information about universal mental illnesses. The individuality of mental illnesses. Psychological disorders are derived from personal experience or chemical imbalances within the brain, and as more causes are discovered, the less general mental illnesses become. Everyone has a fingerprint, but no two fingerprints are the same. Much like mental illnesses, two people may have the same disorder, but the two are not exactly the same. These disorders, however, come with the cultural foundation of the patient, so their mental illness revolves around their culture because a mind cannot exist without a critical base. Since everything we've known from birth has stemmed from a culture, it's natural for a mental illness in one part of the world to be slightly different from the same illness somewhere else. However, this doesn't mean that the patient has to follow a strict guideline in order to match their culture. The culture almost serves as a loose guideline. Mental literacy. American medicine has pushed the world's literacy of mental illnesses by imposing their own guidelines with new technology. Diseases like schizophrenia and depression were created and shared by the US. For example, the US promoted the idea that the mental illness should not be considered as diseases of the brain, or they should be considered as diseases of the brain in which the patient has little or no choice in their illness. This concept was supported by the National Alliance on Mental Illness in the United States for credibility. This general idea was used to attempt to reduce the prejudice against those with mental illnesses, trying to juxtapose mental illnesses and physical illnesses. Dr. Sheila Mehta, a professor at Auburn University in Montgomery, wanted to view the effects of this change in perspective. She performed a test using a subject and an actor. The actor would tell a test subject that they suffered from a disease that altered their biochemistry or a disease that was a mental disorder. The experiment was designed so that the test subject would teach a sequence of button presses to the actor, and if the actor made a mistake, the test subject would have to endure a minor shock that progressively got worse with each mistake. The test subjects, when the actor claimed to have a mental disorder, said that the shocks went from barely noticeable to minor. However, test subjects who considered their partner to have a physical disease were more likely to say that the shocks hurt, even though they were the same. Subjects of her experiment were much more patient when participating with a person with a mental disorder than with someone with an impairment of their biochemistry. As Mehta said in 1997, the results of the current study suggest that we may actually treat people more harshly when their problem is described in disease terms. So, to stigmatize or not to stigmatize. Due to the drive of mental illness's perception as a difference within one's biochemistry, stigmas in other countries have decreased, especially in the US. In other countries, reports show people use phrases as one would describe a physical illness when asked to describe what constitutes a mental illness. However, Dr. Mehta's tests seemed to backfire, as the subjects who encountered people with a disorder in biochemistry were less willing to be in the presence of those with mental disorders. Research shows that from the 50s to the 90s, the Americans' perception of a schizophrenic person became more dangerous, steadily increasing over the years. This may be because people who perceive mental illnesses in biomedical terms are more likely to think that people with mental illnesses are more unpredictable. Although we have become more welcoming of the mentally ill people by destigmatizing mental illnesses, we may actually be backing away from them unconsciously.
So this article goes from talking about all of those features to narrowing in on the mental illness of schizophrenia. And people with schizophrenia are treated better in developing countries than they are in the first world countries. And by this I mean countries such as the United States and the countries seen in Europe. Studies by the World Health Organization, which lasted over 30 years, found that people with this disorder in countries outside of the United States and Europe, as I said, had much lower relapse rates than those within them. Julie Magruder went to the country of Zanzibar to explore this mystery as to why this is the case. She found that since the people in Zanzibar have a strong sense of community, they do all in their power to ensure that the individual with the illness is kept a part of the community and kinship group. Through this, she found that the individuals of this notion believed that the person with schizophrenia had an affliction and the mental illness was not a part of their identity. In America and countries inside of Europe, they go outside of the realm and they start talking about the person as having some sort of disease that defines them, whereas in these countries they go and actually like believe that the person is just having an affliction and that this isn't defining of them. So communities help control schizophrenia. Unlike in the United States, the affected individuals in Zanzibar had a certain calmness in their life that allowed them to control how the illness went through its course. They were a part of the community, and their community helped guide them through any questions they might have had, unlike seen in the United States. Research has found that people with schizophrenia have a much better chance of controlling their illness if they are getting avid support from the communities and are being kept a part of it. In the United States, these individuals get different sorts of treatments from their family members and the communities, making their relapse rates much higher than those in countries in Zanzibar. So this picture pretty much goes to see how people with schizophrenia are treated in other countries. They are treated as people and a part of a community, where in countries like the United States, they are pushed to the side and seen as outsiders. So people living with schizophrenia in America, having a high expressed emotion rate, which includes having criticism, hostility, and too much involvement emotionally to a person with the illness, is seen in America. Out of all the countries in the world, America was found to have the highest expressed emotion rates towards those with illnesses like schizophrenia, with a high EE rate of 67% for white families in the United States. These individuals with the illness are ridiculed and meant to feel as if they are lower than those around them because they have an illness while the people around them do not. This does not mean that the family members are cold-hearted by any means or mean to go and ridicule them. However, since Americans have the stigma that people can overcome anything with overt dedication, as in America, people believe that people are warriors of their own destiny and they could do whatever they want to with their life. The family members go above and beyond to try and ensure that the individual passes this phase of their life per se, as they believe that right now they are just going through schizophrenia and they could get over it instead of actually accepting them for who they are with this disease. Why Americans can't see the big picture. In the grand scheme of things, the stigma brought forth by the Western world, in which people are headstrong and can control their own destiny, belittles the lives of people with schizophrenia, as they are criticized for not trying hard enough to overcome the bump in their road of life. Countries that have a strong sense of community have a lower EE, which allows them to keep the individual with the illness amongst the community instead of making them feel as an outsider. And I actually have a personal experience that goes along with this. One of my dad's friends in high school, they weren't that close, but he told me the story. He told me that his life was okay in high school and like they didn't really see the signs of him having schizophrenia. But when he was, I think, 32, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and his parents got nervous of them, and everybody in their family kind of shifted away. And this led to the man going to Pennsylvania and living by themselves in an outhouse. And this led to him becoming extremely paranoid. He didn't have a community to support him. And in the middle of the night, one night, he actually ran out of his house thinking that somebody was following him, where nobody really was, but he had that sense because of this paranoid schizophrenia. And they found him 2 weeks later in a lake, like floating because he ran into the lake and he drowned. So things like this, without having a community behind you and having people there for you through this illness, it can get the better of them, as it did with him. So this article does a very good job in comparing an individual's brain structure to the construction of a cake. A cake needs all the perfect ingredients, which include sugar, eggs, butter, flour, vanilla, salt, and whatever extraneous things you need with it to bring forth some sort of good product that will be tasty and actually taste like a cake. In comparison, a brain needs all of its various functions to work together effectively and efficiently in unison, or some sort of mental illness is surely to arise. So, in summation, the globalization of mental illnesses is leading the problem against those with mental illnesses. If common misconceptions keep coming forth against these individuals, they will continue to be seen as outsiders more and more instead of being felt as if they are in a community. To be more accepting, we need to ensure these individuals know it is not their fault that they have this mental illness and they are part of communities and that they will get the help they need. The mental illnesses are not defining of them and are mental obstructions that should not belittle the capabilities that an individual with these mental illnesses has by any means.